Okay, great. Well, we are here today on the Gravity Podcast with Bruce Henderson. Bruce, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me. It's great to meet you.
Yeah, it's great to meet you too. And I'm really excited to hop in to hear more about your journey. As you know, we generally like to start all the way back as far as we can. So tell me a little bit about kind of your earliest childhood memories, your family, your upbringing, where you're from, just, a little bit about that part of your life.
Yeah, I grew up in a small town in Oklahoma called Stillwater, which is also home to Oklahoma State University. My father was a college professor. And I have three sisters who I always hasten to say are much smarter than I am and very accomplished as well. And we grew up in this town. It was an interesting town. It was Oklahoma is a very conservative place. My father was a college professor. There was a little bit of division between people associated with the university and those more associated with, traditional Oklahoma occupations like farming and so forth. And it was an interesting place to grow up. Like many people who grew up in my era, it was a somewhat innocent time in the sense that we didn't lock our doors when we went away during the daytime or even on vacation. And at a very early age, I got really interested in music and started playing guitar and that kind of stuff, and really made my choice of where I went to college at the University of Texas based on a place that I felt had a good music scene.
Yeah, interesting. So I'm just curious, just kind of right out of the gate, you're alluding to kind of this difference between, having a family, a father, that's involved in an academic setting versus maybe kind of the traditional Oklahoma farming or whatever else, kind of fell more into the traditional industry. And I'm wondering, like, well, what was that like? Like, were your parents, where were they from? And kind of, did they go to Oklahoma for the work and then have to deal with that shift? And just how prevalent was that for you? Knowing that, you ended up kind of going into music, it feels like there was clearly a kind of an environment that facilitated something that maybe just wasn't consistent with the rest of the atmosphere you were in.
Yeah, it's a good question. And also, in the fullness of time, I've come to a different understanding of how people feel included or excluded. I consider myself very fortunate. We had a stable household, and while we were no means wealthy, we certainly had enough food to eat. And my parents were from the Northeast, and my father taught colonial history. And he used to say, somebody has to die for you to get a job, because there aren't that many colonial history professorships. But I think there definitely was a feeling of otherness being there. But I also have come to believe, as I said, as I get older, I think many people grow up feeling like they're outside the norm. So I certainly don't think I'm unique in that respect. But I also felt, I think times have changed a great deal. I was growing up in the 60s and 70s. And one thing that's dramatically different now, I like to say I'm a really old digital native, because I started getting into the web in 1995 after a music career and a career as a freelance writer. And but what strikes me as I look back on my life, because I did pursue a music career and made a number of albums. I made an album on A&M Records and did a number of things, is that unlike today, I was a kid, I was obsessed with music, and I would look at these album covers and hold them in my hand. And I had no idea how to get from where I was to that. And I think that kids today have a different view of that because of the web. I always thought when I moved to New York in the early 80s, my friends who had grown up in New York had pretty much to a person, if they wanted to pursue something in the arts or really any field, either their parents knew somebody or knew somebody who had done that. So, even talking to my parents about, I'd love to have a career in music, they had no idea how to to make that happen, and I didn't either. So you kind of had to go back then without the web. You kind of had to go find your destiny. But yeah, definitely going back to the original question, I think it was definitely sort of a feeling of outsiderness. My parents were extremely liberal. Oklahoma is perhaps the most conservative state in the union, arguably. So it definitely shaped that mindset. But that's also, I think, a writer's perspective. You know, I'm a writer by vocation. I think many writers are sort of introverts. And
well, I'm a little intrigued, and maybe this is just kind of a personal fascination and kind of why we, spend some time on the podcast talking about these early days. I'm really getting the sense that, you had this environment that you were growing up in that really facilitated you being yourself and kind of following your interest despite what might maybe the broader environment was like. Your parents clearly did that. They were liberal in a conservative state. They were in an occupation that was maybe not as celebrated in that part of the country. And so did they kind of really model that for you? Did they speak to it? Or tell me a little bit about kind of how the music really grabbed you. What was it? Was it a combination of like something inside of you that was really drawn to it, or how much of it was really influenced by your family?
That's a really good question. My father was a bit of a player himself. He had played. He played trombone. He played guitar. He played in swing bands growing up. I think he had some musical aspirations, but I remember actually much later when I graduated from college and announced that I wasn't, in fact, going to pursue a straight job, but instead I was getting in a van with 5 other people and going to New York to live in a 1-bedroom apartment together. Him saying, and I said, look, I'm going to try to make a go at this music thing. And he said, I said, are you disappointed? And he said, no, I just don't want you to be disappointed. And I got disappointed, and that's what life is about many times. You get disappointed until you're not anymore. But yeah, I got, when I grew up in a slightly different time when I and everyone I knew was completely obsessed with music. It wasn't a background to us. It was very central to our lives. And it was a different experience. We had to get in a car and go to Tulsa or Oklahoma City to see a concert. Music videos hadn't come along yet. So the only thing I'd seen of the musician that I loved was still images on a record. And I just knew I wanted to do that. And
how young were you when you really kind of knew you wanted to do that?
7.
Yeah. Well, it's an interesting thing. I just spent 3 days in a conference with Peter Diamandis and this kind of group of futurists, and they talk every year. This is my probably 5th year doing it, about moonshots.
Yeah.
And in Peter's language is your MTP, your massively transformative purpose, and over the 3 days, and I've seen this year after year, there are people who leave what you would think would be kind of like dream jobs because they are just really absolutely on fire, lit up about doing something. They just cannot live with themselves if they don't chase it. And I think sometimes that's inherent. Sometimes you catch a bug, or you kind of ride a wave, something that kind of really takes you. But it sounds to me like at 7 years old, for whatever reason, this is like a calling.
Yeah, it really was, and it's interesting as time went by. I'm not a great player. I'm a really good songwriter. Music's a really interesting profession because, like many sort of so-called tournament professions like acting or music, you can be very, very good and still not succeed.
Mm-hmm.
But what I came to understand over time, and it's interesting as I look back now at sort of my career trajectory, I've seen this, is that, my real calling was to write. I'm a songwriter. I've written a book. I've just written another book. And I ended up being a copywriter in advertising before I went on to become a creative director and so forth. But I think sort of that form of self-expression through writing was truly my calling and something I felt I absolutely had to do. And also it was I think it was quite a different time, because in the late 70s, early 80s, you could release independent singles, which we did. And the drinking age on most college campuses was 18. So you could go from town to town and play college bars and sort of get by. I mean, and by get by, I mean get by. We moved to New York, again, 6 of us, living in a 1-bedroom apartment. We paid ourselves $50 a week. The band paid for the rent and the parking space for our van, and we would tour the country. And we did this for a few years, and got by and had an incredible time, and saw a great deal of the United States. As I like to say, we saw the worst part of every town in America, because that's where the bar is, and it was a great way to get exposed to, what, and each, as you know, and each experience we have informs the next. And I came to have a real fascination for just people and their dreams, which led me to write my first book, Waiting, which was about waiters and waitresses in oral history, and lead to some of the work I did later. But
let me just hop in there, because I think what you're touching on is something that is really important. This idea that everything can lead to the next thing. And what you said, and or I guess maybe I labeled a calling, from a music side, this thing that you have at 7 years old. It feels like it's absolutely, a real calling. It's something in you. It's around your family. You want to do it, right? So much so that when your dad tells you don't want to be disappointed, you say, "I'm going anyway," right? And yet, it ends up not actually being the calling, right? But it was really, really important to get you to the next thing. And so in kind of a mystical way, and I kind of believe it's actually not that. My belief is like it is actually a part of a design, a grand design, right? That we don't always understand. It really was a calling. It just wasn't the calling or the final calling. And that seems to be kind of what happened for you. And I think, what's happened for me, and kind of how it goes if you're open to it.
I think you're hitting on something very interesting, which is, I think it is a calling. I just don't think it was shaped in the way I thought it would be shaped.
Right.
I pursued music. I made records. I got a record deal. The record didn't sell. I started writing other things. I got a book deal. Book did okay. And when you look from the perspective of where we are today, it's possible to string these things all together in a straight line. But as you're having the experience, as you're walking through life, it can very often feel like you're going down blind alleys. And all I knew was that I wanted to write, and that I wanted to find a way to make a living doing it. And I basically took any writing I could find. As a result, I've written for magazines, I've written for television, I've written books, and now, I'm in advertising, because I got very interested in the publishing potential of the web when it came along. And there was a very early editorial website called Word.com, and a guy called Sabin Streeter, who was one of the editors of the book Gig, which I was a contributor to, did essentially what we're doing now, but in a different format. He went out and asked people about, the work they did, and they compiled those columns into a book. But It's one of the reasons why I think, and this leads back to an earlier part of our conversation, I think it really is important to figure out what you like doing, because that's your calling, and the shape of the job it becomes, or the nature of the living you make, or the success you will have derives from that, but isn't completely determined by it. So, when often when I speak to students now, I have a good job. I'm a chief creative officer of an advertising agency within a brand, but I've had that role in 3 different agencies before this. And so I'll often speak to students at school and they'll say, oh, what's your aspiration? Is there a bigger job after this? And I'm a writer by vocation. My aspiration is to write a sentence that makes you have to read the next one. That's at the core. That's what I do. So I think it's really important to attach yourself to that level of your vocation, which is, do you love the thing you do, and is it incredibly important? And must you find a way to do it, and hopefully make a living doing it?
And what I hear when I hear you say that seems really important is that you aren't anymore, and I don't know if this is true or not. So please tell me. I guess maybe I should do a better job and just ask you a question instead of make an assumption.
I like assumptions too.
I guess the question really is have you been able to let go of attachment to outcome? Because when I hear you say your job is to write a sentence that makes you want to read the next one, it seems to me like you're so dialed in on just being a writer. All you want to do is write what's in front of you in that moment, and maybe there's some, broader attachment to how somebody responds to it, but it isn't so much about the deal, the record label, the book deal, the being something or somebody other than just being a writer. Is that true? Or is there still kind of the attachment to outcome that, is we all wrestle with?
I'd be lying if I said there was no attachment to outcomes. At the same time, I think the relative importance has changed a great deal. I think, when you start out wanting to be something like a musician or be in a rock band, you have visions of what that lifestyle looks like and outcomes. And as time goes by, I think if you're fortunate and you really love what you do, you become much more deeply invested in the act of doing it. I do know I still play music. I haven't released anything since 2000, but I have a collection of new songs that COVID has given me because I work from home now, and I'll probably release something. But it feels much better to not be doing it with an outcome in mind. And I don't think it's hard. It's an interesting question because I don't know if this is accidental or coincidental. But I wanted a career in the music business so badly, and got a record deal, and then made more records after that, and appeared on national TV and that kind of stuff. But sometimes it seemed like the more I wanted it, the more that I wanted the outcome, and the harder I tried for it. In many ways, the more elusive it became, or at least I didn't achieve the success I was striving for. When I got into the business I'm in now, I came into it, wanting to make a living writing. And my path forward has seemed so much easier than when I wanted an outcome much worse.
Yeah, there's just something I want to click on a little further with you there, that I think is something we all grapple with, and some more than others, but it does feel like there is something incredibly valuable about really letting go. And when I hear you create that, you've been creating music during COVID and you probably will release it, but that's not why you were doing it. It feels like it's about something else, right? It's about pleasure, maybe joy. I don't know. Maybe you could elaborate on what that was like or what that was about, so that maybe, people can hear how it goes to kind of actually let go a little bit, right? And it's like this kind of interesting thing, which I think is totally okay, actually, and maybe even really good thing where you might actually release it, right? And it might actually become something monumentally successful. I mean, however you define that, right? But that wasn't where you started. And so there's something about that maybe you could just speak a little bit more to, because I think this is really important.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting thread of this conversation, because I think the work I'm doing now, both with writing fiction and writing and recording music, is really about, in many ways, of course, communicating what I'm thinking and feeling, which has always been a piece of it. But as important, it's about the craft. I think, one of the things I often, again, talk to students about is appreciating craft. I think people, particularly people who are not involved in the arts or the fine arts, often think that people who do that stuff, it's just pure inspiration. But I think almost anyone who writes or paints or dances or any other form of artistic expression would tell you that it's about 2% inspiration and the rest is really craft. And I think, you come to appreciate the craft more. And I certainly have during this period. And I think I record both to see how I've matured as a writer and a player and a singer, and also for the pure pleasure of it. At the same time, I think that, a career, and I think it's one of the reasons why I found moving forward in advertising, and I was very fortunate to get into it in an age when most people actually retire, was that, when you're working towards a career in the fine arts, you work basically every waking hour. I think it's impossible to overstate how hard people in the fine arts work at what they do. And often, for little or no pay. I have great respect for people who choose that path. I came to a point in my life where I just felt there were diminishing returns. And also, I had a life event that caused me to need health insurance, and I had to sort of leave at the age of 40. So I followed a different path. But in terms of being able to appreciate what I do now, I have a very, very different impression of it. And it is really about the joy of creating stuff.
Yeah. I think that, you're touching on a really important point on the craft piece. What I would say is, my experience is that whether it be fine arts or any profession of choice, that if you view it as a love, a passion, a kind of calling of sorts, you really want to get into all of the intricacies of it and struggle through it and learn it and get better at it. And it's about something that feels way more a part of you than just something that you do. Right? Something that you're trying to do to make money or to get famous, or right. You love it so much. It's like, I don't know, anything, there's certain people you talk to or conversations you have that just feel so effortless and energizing, right? And you want more of that. That's kind of, to me, this craft piece where it's like when you find that, you don't have to even look at it like, well, I want to master this craft. It's like, I'm just doing it because I love it. I can't get enough, right? And I'm curious if you don't mind kind of speaking. You mentioned, a life event. If you're comfortable sharing a little bit more about that, oftentimes I find that is a catalyst for change for whatever reason. Is that something that you can elaborate on?
Oh, absolutely. I'm happy to. Yeah, it's in 1999, I just released my second solo album on an independent label in the US, and it was doing quite well. I was invited to play on David Letterman's show, and as is often the case, it was an independent label. Letterman was a fan of the type of music I did, so I got invited to go on the show, and it was wonderful. And as is often the case, there wasn't great distribution of the record. I was on indie label, so it didn't produce a huge step change in my lifestyle. But it was one of those moments in the life of an artist where you feel like, oh, wow, the record's getting good reviews. I've just been invited to be on this national show. Everything's great. And, those are the types of things as an artist that help renew your commitment to the path you're on. But then I was diagnosed with testicular cancer. And so I basically had to step out of my life for a year. And several things happened. One, I didn't have health insurance, which wasn't, or I just received health insurance, but it didn't cover my treatment. I was very fortunate. I was a musician and not an insurance salesman because my musician buddies did a benefit concert and helped cover my treatment at Sloan Kettering in New York, which was great. But coming out of that, I realized that having that type of lifestyle was no longer an option for me. So I needed to look for a full-time job. And it's interesting, this is somewhat unique to the United States among developed countries. As I started working in advertising, I had occasion to work around the world, but I was in Denmark and working on a project for a client that was concerned wind energy. And we spent a good part of the summer looking at wind farms in the ocean and photographing them and stuff. It was a wonderful project. But in the course of that, I came to know a bunch of Danes well. And what became very clear to me, since they have national health, was that people don't take jobs for health insurance.
Yeah.
They do the work they want to do because they want to do that work. That wasn't an option for me. So fortunately, I found a way into, during the .com boom, to a pioneer web shop called agency.com. And found, to touch on what we talked about earlier in our conversation, that all my experiences I had in life were applicable to what I've been doing. Suddenly I was, making websites and ads for commercial companies, but I was writing. I was writing dialogue. I'd written a season of a kids show before that. I was recording music. And suddenly all the crafts I'd put together worked in this occupation. And, I was able to make a living doing, as I like to say, it was a terrific plan C. But it was really because I'd had cancer and I couldn't live without health insurance.
Yeah, and so I'm wondering, kind of, following this thread about, kind of how your life is unfolded and sometimes maybe not, according to plan. In hindsight, how do you view the experience of having cancer and having the fact that you needed to switch careers to get insurance? How does that? I hear you, and your conversation or the converse. I hear your understanding of what's happening in other parts of the world, and I agree with you. This is a problem in our country. It's shocking that it's still a problem, but it is. And I get that point. But from a personal standpoint, how do you look at that experience in hindsight?
It's multifaceted, I think. In the end, I would say, and it's hard to tell whether we self-justify or delude ourselves, but I would say it was an incredibly positive experience. First of all, I think I don't know if I could have continued living the way I was living, driving from town to town in a van and playing gigs and, trying to make a living. Secondly, it gave me a very good window into the nature of human life and mortality. And thirdly, one thing that was really unexpected was it gave me a completely different view of how important I am, which is not at all.
Mm-hmm.
You can I literally stepped completely outside of my life for a year. Mm-hmm. And, the world went on absolutely fine without me. At the same time, I was overwhelmed by the compassion and care of my friends at that time. It really changed my perspective on life 180 degrees in many ways. So in that regard, I'd say it was incredibly positive. I wouldn't wish cancer on anybody.
Yeah.
But I find that many fellow survivors take something positive away from the experience.
Yeah, and I think that you can choose to decide what you want to take away. And I'm happy to hear that you have chosen the experience of it being positive. And I say that in that, like, I think it really is a choice, that you have that kind of a perspective, that you could. Other people, there are certainly people that say, this happened to me, and it screwed up my this or that, right? But you have learned from it in a really profound way, a way that shifted you permanently, probably, and it led you into different work. And I tend to believe, this is just my choice, my belief, that sometimes these changes of state, these state changes are almost like forced upon us because we might not do it on our own. And not that like you wish, like you said, cancer on anybody, and it's hard to kind of grapple with death and near death and the threat of death being something that's like put on us for our benefit. That's a tough concept to really embody, but it does feel like sometimes that's the case, that sometimes we need some sort of seriously eye-opening, state-changing event to really get us to next.
I completely agree with that. I also hope it shapes, over the years, I have a job that can be very time intensive, and I love my work and I love the places I have worked and I love what I do, but I hope it shaped the way that I interact with people in my work and the people who, over the years have reported to me and so forth. I think it gives you a different perspective on, I call myself a writer by vocation, and that I am. And it's a vocation in the sense that it's something I have to do and would do whether I made money for it or not. But, work is work and life is life. And I think I have the perspective now that, and have had for a number of years, even times in the agency world when I was working, 100 hours a week, which was not completely uncommon, that there are a whole bunch of things that are more important than work, and that people's families and I know this for myself. I would say without hesitation that the most important things in my life are my relationships with the people around me, my loved ones.
Yeah, nice.
I think it changes those things, and I think you do. I do think you do, and it comes and goes. Most of the people I know who have gone through serious health crises, have a different type of gratitude about living. I wish I could say I possess that all the time, but I don't.
Yeah, I think it's natural for that to be heightened at times and kind of fade a little, but there's some sort of change that I think doesn't allow you to ever go back to the way that you were, and then you get another reminder in some other way, and it's just kind of part of the evolution of hopefully if you're actually paying attention and willing to embrace the learnings along the way, it becomes part of your evolution as a human, and I think that's really a beautiful thing, and kind of what we're all intended to be doing is learning from these experiences and becoming better beings. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So that was really the end of a chapter in my life that led me into the work I do now. And
Yeah. Before we go into the work that you do now, which I do want to get into, because I'm really curious about your experience with writing, both agency work and the work that you're doing, authoring your own books. I am curious. I have to ask because I have a son who is a freshman at the University of Texas right now.
Great.
What was it like to be in Austin in those years? It's certainly a very different place today, but the kind of what made Austin, I think, was really happening at that time. So talk a little bit about that.
It's funny you mentioned that because yesterday I was talking with a production company in Austin, and they were sort of evenly divided between people who say they absolutely love Austin now, and others who said they wished it was what it used to be. Austin was great. I moved to Austin in 1979, and it was a really interesting time musically and also for the town of Austin. The University of Texas was a great school, and I got a wonderful education and really met some wonderful people there, none at school, all through the music business. But at the time, the town was, in the 70s, there had sort of been this cosmic cowboy thing happening with Willie Nelson and Ray Wiley Hubbard and all these guys down there. And there was this sort of confluence, but this was common in the music industry in the 70s. There was a burgeoning punk scene, which is sort of the piece I was involved in. And there was this incredible rhythm and blues scene. Stevie Ray Vaughan was playing clubs then, and the Fabulous Thunderbirds featuring his brother Jimmy Vaughan were playing clubs then. And Delbert McClinton was playing clubs in Austin. He was from there. And then there was still the cosmic cowboy thing happening. And then there was this punk thing happening. It was this incredible town, and everybody loved all the other music. If you went to see Joe Ely at, a club, and Joe's one of my favorites, the room would be full of like these hippie cowboys and punks, and everybody liked everything. And it really was an incredibly magical time. And at the time, Austin was quite cheap. I lived in a small house right off the campus, and it was $165 a month. And it was, which is, I'm sure, not what your son's experiencing.
No.
And the entire metropolitan area at the time had, I think, 450,000 people, and now it's close to 2 million. And, Austin's expanded out towards Round Rock and Bastrop, and these communities that were once small towns are sort of now on the edge of Austin. I loved Austin then. I love Austin now. I felt the same way about New York. When I lived in New York, and I lived there for 3 decades, people would always say, "Oh, it was so much better back, name your time." And it was great then. But I think, and this I learned, it's interesting. This I learned from touring. One of the first things I learned touring was you can have a great time anywhere if you don't expect it to be someplace else. If you go to New York expecting it to be Austin, or if you go to Kansas City expecting it to be Albuquerque, you're going to have a lousy time. But if you meet people who live there and kind of do what they do, you can have a great time. And again, Austin was magical then, and I still think it's magical. One of my sisters lives there. As a matter of fact, interesting fact, the manager of the band I moved to New York with, a guy called Roland Swenson, he moved to New York with us and lived in that 1-bedroom apartment. And after a while, decided he couldn't live with the crazy band anymore and moved back to Austin and started South by Southwest. So Roland was the smartest of all of us. And but it was it's always, and I think Nashville, where I live now, has several things in common with Austin, which is Austin has a great university. It's physically beautiful. It's in the hill country, and there's water nearby. But I think having, I'm partial to university towns because I grew up in one, but I think having a great university in a town really forms a type of culture that's conducive to music and a certain type of lifestyle. And, Nashville's the same way. It has Vanderbilt, and in many ways, it's Austin's sister city with the music business here. So, yeah, Austin was paradise then.
Yeah.
What people say is true.
Yeah, it's I kind of expected you to say that, and I like the fact that you also still think it's great. And, we have dear friends in Nashville, and, we've talked to them about how Nashville's changed. And you're right about New York. I think, your perspective of, it depends on kind of, your mindset really, and it just kind of embracing change in general. Or if you don't like how it's changed, find someplace else that speaks more to you. That's okay too.
Yeah, or help change it. I think
help change it, right? Even better.
What I've come to realize is, one of a recipe for suffering and disillusionment is expecting things not to change. Mm-hmm. It really is. I think you simply have to find what's good about your situation or the place where you live or the people you're surrounded with, or else you're just going to be unhappy.
Yeah, I've seen that, a lot in people over the last year that are moving from LA to Austin, and they're getting there and going, well, actually the housing's not that much cheaper. And when you factor in, the lack of labor, the services are more expensive, and it's really hot here, and right, and so it's like wherever you are, there you are.
Exactly. So, I was about to say the same thing. I think many cliches are absolutely true, and that's one of them. Which is, the one cliche I think is not true is you can't judge a book by its cover when you're talking about books themselves, because I find that great books often have great covers. But I think
my father-in-law, who spent his career in retail, said he used to say, "People that think money doesn't matter are shopping in the wrong stores."
Well, it's interesting. I do believe that wherever you go, there you are. I think it's often not the place that's making you unhappy. Let me put it that way.
Let's talk about your writing and your work today. I am really intrigued by the path that you've taken as a writer and the work that you're doing now. And I'm curious to hear either about the agency work or the novels that you've written, the nonfiction work that you're writing. I'm curious about all of it. I have an intrigue with writing myself. I see a lot of, I write for kind of my own pleasure, journal, that just kind of moving energy. But I have a curiosity with, maybe there's something more there. And I love the art of it. I have friends that are in the movie business, and we talk about scripts and I see a lot of people writing books today in the business world that are really just used as like fancy business cards, which has never really spoke to me. I think it lacks the kind of real creative art part of it. So give me some insight into what it's like to be a writer and what you're up to.
Yeah, I think it started for me. I started writing about what I knew. I wrote some work for a magazine called Oklahoma Today in Oklahoma about the history of music in Oklahoma. And that was after, having written a number of songs and released a number of records. And I've always been fascinated with the written word. And then I started getting other small writing jobs for magazines and little TV things. But I grew up working in restaurants and had waited tables, and I noticed that a lot of people had written books about restaurants, but they were always about the kitchen and the chef, and nobody had ever written about the front of the house. And when I worked in restaurants, if you've ever worked in a restaurant or hung out in one, the people who work there are absolutely fascinating. So I was really interested in both the act of how people felt about their jobs, but moreover, sort of what their aspirations were in life. So strangely enough, one of my customers, this is way, way, way back in the early 90s, one of my customers in a restaurant I was working in was a literary agent. And I said, "Oh, I have an idea for a book." And she got this look of horror on her face. And I said, "Oh, I bet a lot of people say that to you." And she said, they do. And she said, "But go ahead and tell me." And I told her that I wanted to write a book of waiter stories. And she said, "That really is a good idea for a book." So I wrote a proposal and we sold it to Plume, which was a division of Viking Penguin. And they paid me to go out and interview people and about their work. So I did that. And that led to the work I did for Word.com, which was also interviewing people about the work they do. I realized early on, after having been in the music business and sort of done some production work in TV and movies, that I find real people much more interesting than celebrities. And so the job of going out and interviewing people about their work was really interesting to me. And from there, I started working in agencies as a copywriter. And really liked that because in many ways, when you're writing, and the early work was for websites, big corporate websites, when you're writing about a company, you have to have an enormous amount of curiosity. You have to understand what they do and figure out how to communicate that in a way to people that's meaningful. So there's a real journalistic bent to it, which I loved. And then along the way, I've always been a big reader. And I had a writing mentor in New York who'd written plays and short stories and novels. And after he published a novel, which I absolutely loved, I said, "When's your next one coming out?" And he said, "Well, I'm not sure I'm going to write another one." I said, "Why?" And he said, "It takes too much stamina to write a novel." So I wanted to see if I could sustain that interest in a story and a narrative for that. A novel's usually 100,000 words or more. And so I wrote a book that is going to come out in May. And it's called Lucky King. And I wanted to see if I could do that. So it's been, that too was also really a labor of love and craft. I think a lot of people have, again, really, and it's why I listen to podcasts like this one. I find people's stories incredibly interesting. Their life stories, but I'm also a huge fan of narrative fiction, and I wanted to see. And I think many people have a story in them, but then it becomes about the craft. Can you sit in the chair for a year and write page after page? And moreover, can you go back and read what you've written? And finally, are you willing to revise it 10 times?
Yeah. I think that's really not understood by the kind of non-writing world or the novice world, that it is really this, idea of mastering craft. There has to be a level of commitment. And in order, I think, for there to be a level of commitment, there's got to be something more motivating behind it. There has to be a love for it because it is grueling. When you think about great work and you think about the level of detail that somebody goes to paint a picture, to describe a situation, to really give you a connection to a character that doesn't exist, you've got to really get into it. You have to imagine every little sense, and that is really, really hard work. And then, like you said, not only do you have to do it once, you have to go back and you have to read it and do it again and again and again, 10 times, however long it takes. I mean, it's really, I think it's just so admirable to be that committed and that passionate about doing something. Seeing that all the way through. And I am a little curious, you started off, talking about nonfiction work and, kind of people's stories. Obviously, I share your enjoyment for that and see the benefits. And that's why I'm doing this podcast, is I just think there's so much benefit in the story part. What I'm curious about is when you write a novel, how is it that you pull from real life experience to create these characters? In other words, like, are they really people that you have experienced in life, and then you're kind of creating them to be whatever you want them to be for this novel? Or, how much of it is really based in reality?
That's a good question. I'm not sure I know the answer to it, in the sense that I think, everything pulls from our experience. This book that I've written takes place in early 2002 in New York. It's the year after the World Trade Center was attacked, the horrible events of 9/11. I was in New York then. I was working about 6 blocks away when that happened. And it concerns, among other things, there's a character in it who I think represents some of the corrosive effects of sort of political talk radio. So it's very observational. I think certainly when you try to shape characters, they're based on traits you've seen in other people. But I was thinking about it as I sit here talking to you. I think it comes from the same place of the work that you're doing. It comes from this curiosity about what it means to be a human on this earth. I think, and that's the thread through all of this conversation, and the thread through the work you're doing with Gravity is, again, what is it like to be a human being in this time, in this place? How do those experiences affect you? How do they affect the work you've done? And how does all that experience, how is expressed through you and affect other people? I think it all comes from the same place about this, the curiosity we have about the mystery that is living. And I do think of it as mystery. It all comes back to that for me.
Yeah, I really, I love that. I love the kind of mystery and all of it, and yet the embrace and kind of the beauty and divine perfection that is there. And I'm reminded of a quote that I saw recently. Russell Brand reposted a George Eliot quote where he said, "What do we live for if it's not to make life less difficult for each other?" And I just, think that's so wonderful. And I love that you're writing, and kind of that voice, to some degree, like you're about trying to bring the human experience forward, which I do think is about ultimately helping each other.
I hope so. It's interesting. I heard someone, or I read an article talking about, and it's certainly something that I ascribe to, that, in a career, and I certainly think of this in terms of my craft, there's sort of 3 phases. There's learning, there's mastery, and then there's giving back in the form of teaching. And I certainly sort of ascribe to that. In the 3rd phase, certainly in the work I do in my daily job, I love the creative aspect of it. I really like the work I've done in advertising. It's challenging, it's fun, it can be very funny. I work with really creative people. But honestly, the piece, especially over the last 10 years, I get the most satisfaction from is watching young creative people, flower and become very productive and immerse themselves in their craft. And that, for me, is where I get the most lasting satisfaction. And I think that that's analogous to a human life. It has to do with the. I don't have children of my own, but I have 10 nieces and nephews, and the joy I see in my siblings and the joy I see in my own life as the younger generation experiences things themselves, and also stumbles and hopefully benefits from the wisdom of the generation older than them. is that you have this opportunity to sort of share back to them what you've learned and hopefully help them, if not avoid some pitfalls, understand them better and walk away with an even richer understanding.
Yeah. And I think kind of going back to the, advice you didn't take from your dad, or, the concern, right? Like at the end of the day, all we can really do is just support each other, as we all kind of have to walk our own path. But I love the idea of giving back and teaching for sure. So, Bruce, this has been wonderful. I loved hearing your story. I'm energized by what you're doing now. I'm excited for your book, and would love to stay in touch and pick your brain and maybe collaborate someday. Before we wrap up, any final thoughts just that you'd like to share with the audience?
It's interesting. We are, 300 and some days into a lockdown for many people, and not for others, with COVID-19, which is it's the first time in my long life that seen a pandemic. And I think at this stage of this, in this time, I think the only thing we can do, far be it for me to tell other people what to do themselves or how to live their lives, but what I've tried to take away from this moment is that there's some positive in all this. I've spent a lot more time with my wife and my family members, and that we'll get through this, and then there are positive things to be learned from it. And hopefully, as you mentioned earlier, I think the best thing we can do in a situation like this is be kind to one another.
Yeah. Amen. Couldn't agree more. And you're right. It's an opportunity for us to choose, are we going to learn and get better and maybe be a little kinder, or how will this shape us? And you're a great example of making good choices to experience life in a beautiful way. So thanks, Bruce.
I've made my share of bad ones, but thanks. It's good to meet you.
Well, maybe we'll talk about those on the next one. But
Brett,
yeah,
thank you so much for having me on. I love the podcast, and health and happiness to you and your family in the coming year.
Wonderful. Thank you. You too, Bruce.